欢迎收看《家国纵横》，我是康凯。什么是具有加拿大特色的中国菜呢？通俗地说，那就是炒杂碎。作家恩辉用了18天，开车走了9000公里，从西岸一路去到东岸，寻找这些炒杂碎的中国餐厅，还出版了著作《杂碎国家》。而在他觅食过程中，穿插着他个人的寻根之旅，发现早期来到加拿大的华人与中国菜一样，不断地适应环境，随遇而安，落地生根，成为了加拿大多元文化的一部分。
The reality is that when Canada embraced the policy of multiculturalism in the latter part of the 20th century, that completely changed the course of my family's story. It changed my grandparents' lives, it changed my dad's life, and it changed my life. That was my dad on his wedding day, and this would have been in front of my Yeye and Ang's house in East Vancouver at the time. When my dad left China, it was around the time of the Chinese Cultural Revolution. He left the country because he said he felt like a weed twisting in the wind. He felt powerless, and I think that what many of them may not have expected was that although coming to Canada brought them lots of new opportunities, gave them many new options for futures that they could pursue, there were many challenges that were still in their way, and many challenges that still left them in some ways powerless and made it difficult for them to be able to pursue.
身为环球邮报记者的安徽写了一本书，叫做《Chop Suey Nation》，意思是杂碎国家，里面描述了他为了寻访加拿大境内的中国菜餐厅以及餐厅主人的故事，开车横跨加拿大，直到东岸的边沿。那么他所谓的杂碎是什么？
What Chinese food is really depends on where you are in the world. Chop suey is my way of describing all of the Chinese food that was created here in North America. This made in North America chop suey Chinese is dishes like chop suey, zap soy, sweet and sour pork for the most part, chicken balls, almond chicken, lemon chicken. You know, these are dishes that you can find really anywhere in North America, any town across Canada. You often see with a lot of these dishes, there's this perfect combination between textures. You often have, you know, something soft, something crunchy, you have something sweet, something maybe a little bit sour and savory. You have dishes that are often very colorful, like sweet and sour pork that's contrasted with the yellow pineapple. Okay, 可以食得啦，食飯。雜碎其實係最早期嚟嘅華人廚師為咗生存，為咗適應西方人嘅口味，所以改變咗佢哋嘅煮法材料。最緊要係就手，於是而家變成咁樣嘅食物。These were dishes that were created mainly in the late 19th and early 20th century here in Canada by the very first Chinese immigrants to Canada and the US. They were mostly men who had come to North America to take part in the gold rush, and then later men who were recruited to come to Canada to help build the railroad. Around the early 20th century, we saw a period of time that's sometimes referred to as yellow peril. That's when you would see a lot of anti-Chinese messages propagated through mainstream media, a lot of policies and legislation put in place that was actually designed to prevent Chinese men from coming to Canada. They suddenly found themselves facing all kinds of obstacles. There were laws put in place that actually prevented them from working in any kind of a profession except for what was seen as not threatening to local workers. So they could work in laundromats, they could work in convenience stores, or they could work in restaurants. Many of them had never stepped foot in a professional kitchen before. Many of them had never tried to run a restaurant before. Many of them probably had never even cooked before. But most of your customers are going to be white, who are unfamiliar with, you know, authentic Chinese food. And maybe a little bit scared to eat authentic Chinese food given all of the negative messages about Chinese people at the time. And so given all these obstacles and these challenges, these men basically started making things up. It was trying to come up with food that would be delicious and somewhat exotic to the customers, but not too exotic so as to scare them away.
炒饭、炒面、糖醋排骨、春卷，这些受到西方人热捧的杂碎主打，其实都是受到历史和地理因素影响而成为似是而非的地道北美中国菜。
So we decided to do a road trip. It made the most sense as a way to travel across the country. We really wanted to focus on smaller towns, and so it didn't make sense to just fly from city to city. As I planned out the trip, we had different ideas of where we wanted to go. I wanted to go up north, but it was challenging for sure. And so eventually we just designed a plan that would take us from Victoria, BC, all the way across to Fogo Island, Newfoundland. So basically from the western edge all the way to the eastern edge of this country. It would be an 18-day trip, and it would be my husband and I, both in one car. So this is a very rough map of the road trip that we took across 18 days. These are just the cities that we stayed in overnight, but of course we were visiting on each day, 2 or 3 sometimes small towns and Chinese restaurants in the little towns in between each day. We also then took a little seaplane across from the mainland of Newfoundland to Fogo Island, which, as you can see, is this teeny tiny little island on the easternmost edge. Within the first day or two of the road trip, I remember just being very excited and telling my husband, like, this is gonna work, because I could just tell. The stories that people were sharing were so amazing. Within the first couple of days, I met William Choi in Stony Plain, Alberta. He is a third-generation Choi to run Bing's #1 Chinese restaurant in this very small town in Alberta. He is the restaurant owner in Stony Plain, but he's also the mayor of Stony Plain. I found a Chinese restaurant in a small town called Vulcan, Alberta, which has become a Star Trek themed town. I found in Glendon, Alberta, where they have a giant statue of a pierogi in the middle of town, and right next to it is a Chinese restaurant run by a Vietnamese woman, actually, and they sell pierogies and also Chinese pierogies, which are what they call dumplings. This is the giant dinosaur in Drumheller, Alberta. They've really capitalized on, I think, dinosaur fossils found around the area, and so they have a lot of dinosaur-themed attractions.
直至他开始寻找小镇中餐厅，安徽才发现，原来他父母多年来经营的 Legion 餐厅也是杂碎餐厅。于是他在著作中，一方面讲述她与丈夫的全国觅食之旅，另一方面忆述他父亲如何追随祖父从中国广东来到加拿大，如何开始经营杂碎餐厅的寻根之旅。两条主轴互相交织，一环扣一环。
There were Chinese restaurants that weren't run, as I mentioned, by Chinese families. There were Vietnamese families running Chinese restaurants. There were Korean families running Chinese restaurants. There were white families running Chinese restaurants. I found in Moncton, New Brunswick, a Korean restaurant that served Korean pizza, which, it's not a Chinese restaurant, sure, but this idea of bringing together cultures and different kind of tastes, improvising and kind of amending dishes to make them maybe more palatable to local taste. It's the same idea, bibimbap pizza to me is a direct kind of sister to chop suey. Many of the first Chinese restaurant owners in Canada were men who had originally come to work on the railroad. And so they ended up setting up these Chinese restaurants in these small towns that had originally been railroad towns. In other cases, I heard from families who chose to live in these remote towns. Some of them told me that they felt like moving to a city might be too competitive, that they would have so many other restaurants that they would have to compete with, whereas in most of these towns, they're the only Chinese restaurant, sometimes the only restaurant. They came here for a better future, they came here for a better life, but With these things, there's always give and take. And the reality is that these immigrants have changed this country, but the country has also changed them. So just like Chop Suey shows this story of adaptation, of evolution, so too has that same story played out on the people themselves. When it came time for a restaurant to change hands, they would sell the entire business often, which would include the restaurant itself. It would include all of the furniture, the chairs, the tables, the cash register, everything in the kitchen. And most importantly, it would include a binder, just like this one, that would include the recipes of every single meal, every single dish that was offered on the menu. You really didn't need to have any experience at all running a restaurant. You would have this binder that had instructions for everything that you had to do. It was basically turnkey. And that's why these restaurants were so similar and are so similar from town to town, city to city, province to province. Before this, I have traveled across the country. I thought I was relatively well traveled. I spent a few summers working as a flight attendant when I was in school. I had been to most of the major cities across Canada, and so I thought I knew this country. But until we actually drove across it and saw all of the little nooks and crannies, not just the major cities, but all of the different towns in between that kind of explain how one place transitions to the next, is just a completely different experience. I do regret the fact that we weren't able to go north. Obviously, there's so much more to the country that we've yet to explore. I heard that story repeated across the country, from family to family. They talked to me about what they had gained from coming to this country. They talked about putting their kids through university, being able to give their kids a good future, a good education. But they also talked to me about what they lost. And for a lot of them, they told me stories of isolation, of loneliness, of not being able to live near their family or be near people in their community, having to live alone in a tiny town in the middle of nowhere. And so I think about that a lot. I think about the give and take, about what was gained, but also what was lost.
先苦后甜，灵活变通，或者这些都是早期移民的坚韧耐力。他们的事迹就好像被浪潮冲刷着的海沙，一浪推一浪，后浪推前浪，这一刻被推上岸，下一刻被卷入海中，一遍又一遍地重复着，看似消失了，其实一直存在。
以上就是本期的节目，各位观众如果想重温的话呢，可以登入城市电视网站，点击节目重温当中家国纵横的链接就可以了。我是康凯，下期节目再会。